process by which space becomes sacred is something I've never seriously considered. Though personally, I do recognize certain spaces as sacred, such as Mecca, and similarly, I see Medina as such. I still took it for granted their sacred status simply due to the former being where I believe God's house is stationed, with the latter being the location of where, who I believe to be God's final messenger, is buried, peace be upon him. But whilst the development of Mecca from a barren valley into the religious center of a global faith has been the subject of many monographs and much debate, nothing has been written for how the collection of oasis settlements called Yathrib were transformed into the widely venerated space today known as the City of the Prophet, or simply as Medina. Nothing except for the 2014 publication titled The Holy City of Medina, Sacred Space in Early Islamic Arabia by Dr. Harry Munt, for which he kindly accepted my invitation onto Real Talk with Tehran Pool in order to discuss. So thank you for stopping by, Dr. Munt, for what I believe will be, God willing, a thought-provoking podcast, and that will hopefully inspire more people to inquire about this subject.
Thanks very much for having me on.
And I'm just going to go over your academic background for audience who might not be too familiar with it. But although within my circle of friends, your work and expertise were suggested to me numerous times. So Dr. Munt is a senior lecturer in medieval history in the Department of History at the University of York here in England. And before joining the department in 2014, he was a British Academy postdoctoral fellow in the Faculty of Oriental Studies and Wolfson College at the University of Oxford. His research and teaching focuses on the history of the Islamic world, circa 600 to 1500. In particular, he works on the history of the Arabian Peninsula in the early Islamic centuries, Islamic holy cities and pilgrimage, and Arabic history writing in the medieval period. And let's get into it. So, a lot of what I have read concerning your book, Holy City of Medina, reports that it is the first book of its kind, with, yes, the first book of its kind dealing with the emergence of Medina as a holy city. Considering that being the case, I would like to know, from where did it start? How did you get the idea to research and write about such a topic, given the fact that there was no precedent for you to work from previously? Or was there a, or was there a, or is there a single work or a collection of works that inspired you to pursue the topic of Medina emerging as a holy city?
Yeah, thanks. It's a good question. I think initially I had in mind, I was interested in this idea of the sort of social political use of sacred space in early Islamic history. And I do remember thinking initially I was planning a study of Mecca or the Hajj or something like that. And it was when I was sort of tentatively looking into that that I realized when thinking about how Medina worked alongside Mecca as a holy city and as a sacred place in the Hijāz, that I wasn't really finding very much scholarship on that was helping to guide me
Mhm.
in my thoughts about that. So basically I decided that that's what I would then do. There's I was at the same time as realizing that there wasn't much modern scholarship on the topic. I was discovering how much primary material there was on Medina, particularly its relatively thriving local historical tradition. And that this was providing a lot of information that could really help historians understand what's going on with Medina. I mean, a lot of people obviously have worked on Medina during the lifetime of the Prophet and in the very late pre-Islamic period, but also how it developed after the Prophet's career and death over the subsequent centuries into a holy city, a sacred place, a pilgrimage destination. How those developments played out over subsequent centuries really sort of began to interest me.
And I mean, just researching this book and looking at the amount of material for studies on places like Mecca and Jerusalem, which you also highlighted in your book, it is astounding that nobody ever thought to kind of apply the same study or research on to Medina, which is arguably the first holy city within the Islamic period. So what is it like researching and writing about a city or region you have never visited? Like, what are some of the challenges and difficulties that came along with that? Because, I mean, especially when it came to the topography part, I had to pull out all kind of maps and see, okay, so this is right there, that's right there. And I know for some concerning some research, people do field work, and I just wanted to know what was it like having to kind of exclude that aspect of the research.
Yeah, it's a I mean, the short answer is it's a strange thing to do, to write about a place that you've never visited. I think part of my answer is that a lot of what I was interested in. So I am very interested in the history of Medina, obviously as a place, but I'm also very interested in the history of ideas about Medina,
Mm,
and a lot of those ideas about Medina are preserved for us from people who lived and wrote and worked and studied and taught in many other places as well. I'm not just interested in fact, part of my argument in my book is that to understand Medina's holiness and sanctity, we have to think of it as a sort of Islamic worldwide phenomenon rather than a local Hijazi
mm,
series of developments. On the other hand, yes, I mean, I am also interested in how Medina's emerging sanctity altered its topography and its topographical development, its urban development. And yeah, that's a very difficult thing. That was very difficult to get my head around. There are some good, there are some quite useful historical maps that help. And as I was putting there's a map in my book on the locations of some of the early mosques that were founded and developed over the first couple of centuries history.
mm.
And as I was doing that, I did find quite a lot of useful guides to the topography of Medina from sometimes from Saudi scholars, also from scholars from other countries as well.
Okay, yeah, Google was really lacking. I had to depend on NASA. I think I found some off of Michael Lecker's Academia EDU page, but still certain sites that I was trying to pinpoint were missing. So I had to use like three maps all spread out on my comp in order to kind of piece them together. And
Michael Lecker's topographical work has been very important for those of us.
And you know, he's the one who turned my attention to the importance of using maps. I mean, I've always understood the importance of using maps, especially when I had read a book. I think it was called The Shallows, and it described how much how maps just totally changed the mapping of our brain. And it was him who turned my attention to the importance. And dealing with this subject, Medina, you definitely have to have maps at your disposal. You know, at the end of your book, you urged scholars to not give up and continue the research on the early Islamic Hijaz. I understand there's a number of obstacles when it comes to researching that region, mainly because not that much material evidence, the lack of archaeological research and whatnot. So, how has your own research progressed in that area since the release of Holy City in 2014? And do you still hold some of the same conclusions detailed in your book?
Um, yeah, I think I still hold to the conclusions that I argued in my book. In terms of where I think later research on or further research, future research on Medina, the Hijaz can go. I suppose my own, well, partly I have research interests that move away from this area, but when it comes to this area, I guess I've been sort of following up on some topics that I came across while writing the book, but didn't have space for
Mm,
the book. So questions about for example, I wrote an article on tradition and reports about the prohibition on non-Muslims residing in the Hijaz. That was a topic that I came across while working on ideas about Medina's sanctity, but wanted to explore in more detail in a later publication. I think you're right that in some ways archaeological research or research into material culture of the region is simply very difficult. In areas around the Hijaz, it seems to be a thriving field, and people seem to be finding and making good historical use of inscriptions, for example, graffiti and some more monumental formal inscriptions from places like South Arabia, Northwest Arabia. And there's lots of archaeological research going on in the eastern side of the peninsula, but the Hijaz, yeah, it still seems there's a little bit of stuff going on in the northern Hijaz, I think,
yeah.
but around Mecca and Medina, no, it's I think that's somewhere where the study of that the central Hijaz region is quite hard to link in a way to some of the studies that are going on in other parts of Arabia.
And you know, with all of the construction going on in that region, I wonder if we'll still be able to recover any of what might have been left inside the dirt for archaeological research to happen. That's one thing that I always think about when I see I don't want to call the buildings atrocious, but all those buildings being constructed in the area. Um, so, I was actually going to leave this area of this aspect of your book out, because I know you're focusing more so on Arabian conceptions of sacred space, but you do highlight Jerusalem in your book. And I do understand why you did so, mainly because the Hijaz region, as you mentioned in your book, we don't have as much information on how their sacred space or holy city or their sacred spaces were, the origins of it or how they were created. But Jerusalem offers a great case study for how these things happen in late antiquity in general, and it being in the same region, more or less. Do you want to go into that, and why you found Jerusalem integral to and why you put it in the beginning before going into the sacred spaces of Arabian conception?
Sure. I think Jerusalem is important for, well, two reasons, maybe a third. I suppose maybe the third is that it is, by the sort of standards of holy places in the early Islamic world, late antiquity, it is very well studied.
Mm.
There's not a huge lot more work to do on it, but there are already some existing studies that can help you get your head around ideas of holy cities in the sort of pre-Islamic late antiquity, but also in the early Islamic world. The two other reasons very much related to that are that Jerusalem clearly is an important city for early Muslims. So when we're thinking about the emergence of Medina as a holy city in the early Islamic centuries, it's not just Mecca we're thinking of it
Mm.
urging alongside. There are other places as well, and Jerusalem is perhaps the most obvious of those other places. But also, in I was trying to a huge amount of, as you know, of modern scholarship is seeking to better understand the historical context in which early developments in the early Islamic period took place.
Mm.
And so when you're thinking about how ideas about holy cities emerged in the first, second, third centuries Hijri, you have to think about other surrounding communities' ideas about holy places and sacred spaces and how pilgrimage should work. And again, Jerusalem just sort of leaps out as a very obvious example of that. I try in my book to I start with that sort of wider late antique background,
Mm.
with places, thinking about places like Jerusalem, and then I try to narrow down a little bit on what we might know about how processes of sanctifying space worked in the Hijaz itself. We might well come on to that. The evidential basis for that is very different, is much more difficult.
Definitely.
So that's why I sort of started thinking about further north. At the same time, though, I don't want to just understand. I don't talk about Jerusalem just to sort of understand Medina's development in light of Jerusalem's. Like I do think there are very different
Oh,
things
definitely.
going on.
And one thing that really stood out to me is that a lot of Jerusalem shared multiple sacred, or a single sacred space could be a sacred space for multiple different faiths. Whereas I didn't kind of get that picture with Medina in the time of the Prophet.
Yeah, I think for Medina, nothing in the evidence we have suggests that there's any sort of we hear almost nothing about pre-Islamic sacred spaces in Medina. We might well assume that there were shrines or places of worship, of course, for different groups, but nothing. We don't have any firm information about it. No. So that's one. I think that's one very obvious. What's the opposite of a parallel? A parallel that doesn't work between between Jerusalem and Medina. Yeah.
Although for this interview, I was definitely looking to see if maybe some kind of sacred space once upon a time existed in Medina or existed at the time of, and we definitely will get to that in a bit. But I do have one more question about Jerusalem, and I'm curious, and I guess I'll ask you now because later in the conversation it won't make sense. But did Jerusalem develop as a sacred city in the eyes of Muslims alongside Medina? Were they both happening at the same time, or did one happen before the other, one start, but were they more or less contemporary to each other in how Muslims viewed them as sacred?
Um, I think it's very. I guess it's easier to answer that question for the second century onwards,
Mm,
when we have, so the 8th century CE, when we have, I think, good evidence for ideas about both those cities,
mm.
as well as Mecca, actually, and like the sort of developing ideas about the sanctity of both space. And sometimes you can maybe see some dialogue between ideas that are developing about the sanctity of those separate cities, and that, you know, proponents of the sanctity of one or the other are engaging in a bit of a dialogue between each other. There's a famous series of hadiths in which, for example, the Prophet says that, you know, prayer in Jerusalem is worth a certain amount of prayers in Medina or Mecca, or vice,
Yeah.
or some combination of those things. So you can see a dialogue certainly over the second century Hijri onwards being debated. As with so many things in early Islamic history, everything gets a lot murkier when you go back into the.
I know. I would have thought, at least how I used to think about the beginnings of Islam, it started out as like one thing, and maybe with the Prophet, it did start out as one thing, but it instantly became many, and then kind of slowly started to, not slowly, but over the centuries, start to converge more or less into schools of certain schools of thoughts and sects. But it seems like early on, it was more regional beliefs. Depending on what region you were in, you believe certain things, even if you did identify with the same sect or proto sect, as some might call it.
Yeah, I think it's certainly a useful model to think about regional differences. Sorry, in the very early Islamic period. It's still quite hard to get a lot of the time of what those meant in practice. We do have some sources that suggest that Jerusalem had some sort of significance for at least some Muslims, important significance for at least some Muslims in the early decades of Islamic history. There's well, it's well known amongst modern scholars, an Armenian history written probably in the 660s CE, maybe, that talks about, it seemed that it's an outsider, obviously. I mean, this Armenian historian might well not know very much about the Muslims and their beliefs, although he tries to explain them to his readers. And one of the things he explains is that they saw Jerusalem and if you like the surrounding Palestine, basically the surrounding Holy Land, as a key sort of as a key territorial ambition of theirs, and that it was an important city for them. So we do get some indications which are at least in the date of the sources that survive are perhaps a bit earlier than those for Medina.
Okay.
I do believe that ideas about Medina and its sanctity were developing over the first century. I don't think they emerged from nowhere in
Okay.
50, 60, 70 years later, but they are developing. But it's a little bit, I personally think it's just a bit too hard to get at some of those processes.
Okay, yeah, because I was curious about that. And I mean, if you go on YouTube, right, and Google Jerusalem, Islam, a lot of content has been created about Jerusalem and Islam. And I just wanted to know, researching this book, if they both developed together as being viewed as
Yeah,
sanctified.
I mean, if you take if you take the monuments that are built in these places, I mean, then yes, the major sort of famous religious monuments in these places are all built around the same time. So the Caliph
The
Abdul
same
Malik,
dynasty a
yes,
lot of the times too.
exactly. So the Umayyad Caliph Abdul Malik builds the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, and his son and successor Al Walid um, builds the first truly sort of monumental version of the Prophet's Mosque
Mm.
in Medina. So you can see there a similar, in terms of their architectural development of as holy cities. You can see something of there's clearly a sort of point in that in Umayyad history where something is going on.
And at the end of your book, you kind of give what you believe were reasons behind the Umayyads doing all of these, undertaking all of this construction. And I do hope to get to it later because I never really. I'm not going to go into it, but I really thought little of the Umayyads and what they contributed to Islamic culture besides maybe the expansionist aspect of it, because they didn't leave too many written works. But seeing all the or reading about all the monuments that they had built and how Muslims still frequent and visit these places today, it kind of changed my mind about the role or what the Umayyads have contributed to Islam. But just to get back on the Haram, because again, I could talk about these things endlessly. Um, there were a few things I didn't know before reading your book. I mean, there were many things, but concerning the Haram or a Haram, I had no idea that it was the premier way of designating sacred space in the pre-Islamic Hijaz, and that other Harams existed in the region besides the one in Mecca. But first, for our audience who might not know exactly what a haram is, or who have only heard the word as it pertains to its use within everyday Muslim jargon, which you might get the idea that it's forbidden. So, what that haram means forbidden. But what are some of the characteristics of a haram and how do they function?
So in terms of, I mean, you're right. The the Arabic root provides a whole series of words that can mean many things, among which forbidden, prohibited, that kind of thing. In terms of the form of what I call sacred space, the haram, it seems to be always a quite a large area. So not just limited to a sort of the small centre of a town. It seems to cover quite a large space. We might get onto this. Medina's early Islamic Haram was several miles in each direction. It's a sacred space, and they are usually defined. So they seem to have their boundaries seem to have been demarcated.
Mm.
Certainly, that's the case at Mecca, and it was probably the case for Medina's as well. So we hear about boundary stones being put up, and this suggests that this is one of the things that suggests that there's something important about entering one, that it's leaving a particular kind of, if you like, profane space and entering a more sacred area. And the other main reason we get that impression, of course, is that we hear about regulations that go with being in a haram. So you can't commonly encountered prohibitions are on things like fighting and violence, harming animals, harming plants, and plant life is often prohibited. I'm trying to think of. There's often a ritual for entering.
I believe ablution.
Yeah, so we
Uh,
hear Islamic period about ablution rituals for.
What about certain clothes? I know when you enter the Haram at Mecca, you're wearing certain clothes. Did this also exist back then in the pre-Islamic Haram?
That I don't think that you don't hear about that. You hear that mostly at Mecca, of course, in connection with the two pilgrimages that take place in and around Mecca, right? The Umrah and the Hajj.
Mhm.
I don't think that the clothing, the change of clothing, is not off the top of. I don't think it's. I don't recall it being something you see reported for other harams in the pre-Islamic period, or particularly in the Islamic period.
Okay.
Um, so that might be something that was linked more specifically to the pilgrimage rituals that took place around Mecca. I mean, there is overlap between. I mean, for one thing, the state of consecration for the Hajj is called Ihram, right, which comes from the same Arabic root as the word haram,
Mhm.
and there are some overlaps in rules. Whilst in Ihram, pilgrims, they can't hunt, they can't fight. A lot of these rules that apply to a haram more broadly apply in those cases as well. So there are overlaps, but I think there are also some distinctions. When I try and think of, I think so. Basically, it probably is the case that not all harams are the same, right? There are some overlapping features between all of them, but that doesn't mean they're all completely identical in their in
Okay,
their.
so there's not like a across the board. You go from one Haram, you can expect all the same things in every
Yeah,
single one. It's not like
I think
that.
the situation was probably much more fluid than that. So, I mean, for the pre-Islamic period, our evidence is not strong, but what evidence there is, I think, does suggest that things were a lot more fluid than that. Not regulations on violence seem very common. That's one of that does seem to be a fairly common rule across these Hijazi pre-Islamic, very early Islamic harams. That regulation of violence seems very important.
Which I wonder was maybe a motivation for why the Prophet Muhammad had set up a haram in Medina, which I do hope to explore later some of the reasons why, and maybe even introduce some reasons you might not have thought of into why Muhammad had established a haram into Medina, or in Medina. And as I previously stated, and this is mentioned in your book, we know of two other harams which coexisted alongside the one at Mecca in the Hijaz during late antiquity, one at Waj and the other at Bus. Well, I only know of these because academics like yourself have brought them to my attention, so I'm not going to pretend like I have like such information, a lot of information about them. But nonetheless, from where do we get our information, or where did you get your information for the existence of these other harams? Arabic written sources, inscriptions, archaeological finds, and do we have information concerning their historical background and creation, more than what was available in 2014 when you released your book?
I'm not aware of anything that's changed our understanding of these places since 2014. The evidence I had for discussing them comes from exclusively comes from Islamic era literary Arabic sources, and that both we hear about in slightly different circumstances and we hear different information about them. So Waj, which is essentially a haram associated with the city of Taif, not far from Mecca, and its ruling or controlling tribe, Thaqif. Waj we hear about because when the Muslims under the Prophet take control of Taif and its surrounding areas, the Prophet draws up an agreement with its inhabitants that allow for the continuation of their haram.
Yeah, I thought that was so interesting. I would have never expected that.
Yeah, there's another form of, which we might get onto, of protecting space, demarcating space in Arabia called Hima, and there are several more agreements between the Prophet and other tribes around Western Arabia in particular, where those tribes are allowed to retain their Hima.
Mm.
But at Waj, I think it was the only one I found anyway when researching this book, where a group was allowed to keep its own haram. And we hear about this through accounts from Sirah, the Prophet's biography of the takeover of that region. We also hear about it in Hadith literature as well. So many later Hadith scholars, keep transmitting these reports about Waj and being a haram. But in terms of its actual history, we hear almost nothing more about it. It's this. To us as modern historians, we can sort of see it. We see this sort of snapshot around the end of the first decade of the Hijrah when the Muslims come to control the region, but we don't really hear an awful lot more about the area as a haram. Bus, on the other hand,
And what is Bus? Because I didn't understand. Was it a region, a
Bus
haram, idol?
is a place. It's not 100% clear where it was. It was somewhere in the middle, in the mid Hijaz. And it's a place associated with the tribe Ghatafan, and we hear about it so again only from later Arabic sources. There's quite a few different stories about it as well, but basically there's a conflict between a few tribes in the pre-Islamic period, probably in the sort of half century or so before the Prophet's career.
Oh, this is the battle of not the battle of the camel, but
No, it's earlier, and it's before the Prophet's career in a series of pre-Islamic sort of battles between different contests between different groups, and one tribe decides that, according to one story, which is the one that I use most in my book, one tribe decides that they've got to the point where they can set up their own haram. And a member of another tribe gets deeply offended by this, and so he leads a war group to raid it, and which they do, and they defeat the tribe that had set up Bus as a haram, and then they commit violence in the haram, which I mentioned earlier, that regulations about violence seem quite important around harams, and because they commit violence in the haram, that proves that it's, you know, void. It's not.
Mm.
It's no longer. It was never. It possibly was never a haram. It's certainly no longer. So we hear
This
about.
transpired a war for quite a while, didn't it?
Yeah, it depends. Different narratives have different accounts of the
Okay.
ongoing war between these two tribes involved. Ghatafan and Kalb have a bit of a history of ongoing tensions at times.
So it's probably anything was just gonna tip everything over.
Yeah, so whereas with the stories about Wajj, it's very hard to think. I mean, we can see if you like, in the Prophet's decision to allow the Haram at Wajj to remain, we can see something of the sort of the diplomacy and the negotiations between different groups that helped to extend the Muslim community's authority in Western Arabia.
Mm.
But we don't see too much else. We don't sort of understand much about what that haram meant to people.
Mm.
At Bus, the main thing that comes across to me from the narratives is that the haram is seen as, for a tribe, having a haram is seen as something prestigious, and in a way that proves their strength, their authority.
Mm.
Among other tribes, it should be emphasized that a lot of so I said these come from later Muslim accounts of pre-Islamic Arabia, often 200 to 300 years later.
Mm.
And so if you think for sort of 3rd, 4th century Hijri, 9th, 10th century CE Muslims, there's no doubt that Mecca is the most important place in the Hijaz, and they project that back into the pre-Islamic period as well.
Mm.
So a lot of these stories and anecdotes and narratives about other harams like Bus are contextualized in the kind of conflict with. It's seen as trying to take away from Mecca's sanctity. The establishment of a different haram is seen as a challenge to Mecca. I'm not so. If we don't have the pre-Islamic evidence to tell us whether that was really the case or not.
Mm.
So I suppose I see the pre-Islamic Hijaz as a region in which there were probably plenty of harams, but
Oh, definitely.
we just don't hear about many of them. And
Probably be in the best interest of later scholars to kind of obfuscate, um, um, maybe have enough to show like, hey, there was certain forms of worship not in line with Islam going on, but not enough to where, you know, you would think this is just a common feature of Arabia, and kind of, like you mentioned, kind of delegitimize the Haram in Mecca.
yeah, I just think, I personally just suspect that in the pre-Islamic period there were harams were much more common, and that obviously the success of the Muslim community led to the success of the Meccan haram and the preeminence of that, and then that couples with, as I'm sure we're going to talk about, the Prophet's establishment of his own haram at Medina,
Yeah.
and the way that then debates about that moved on. But I think the context for understanding those developments is to appreciate that I think harams were not necessarily all that uncommon
Mm.
in the pre-Islamic Hijaz. That's, to a large extent, that's based on just these very few mentions we get of places like Wajj and Bus, though, rather than, we have no comprehensive survey of these things for pre-Islamic Arabia.
And you know, you do mention another word, tahrim.
Mm.
Now I read a review that highly celebrated your book, but one thing they mentioned was that Hima you did not translate, although you did translate Hima. But when I was looking at tahrim, or if I'm my Arabic is horrible, so please excuse me. It's I didn't find a translation for that. I actually had to look it up myself, and I understood it to be a prohibition. So,
Yeah,
how is a tahrim linked to a haram? Just because I want to satisfy my curiosity.
yeah. Sorry, so that's a good point. In the book, the way I use it is a reference to the way it's used. Tahrim, or the verb it comes from, harama, to make a place a haram.
Mm.
So a lot of the hadith reports we get about the Prophet, for example, creating his haram at Medina,
Mm.
will say that. So there's a series of reports in which the Prophet is said to have argued or declared that Abraham made Mecca a haram, or God made Mecca a haram for Abraham. So Ibrahim, so he is making Medina a haram for Muhammad, God's latest prophet. And the verb that tahrim is just the verbal noun or the verb that gets used there. So
Okay,
I
so
just
just creating a haram, basically.
creating
Okay.
yeah. Hima. Do you want to move on to Hima?
No, yeah, actually, yeah, that's another very interesting pre-Islamic Arabian concept for distinguished space. One I only came to discover by reading your book, which, as you just mentioned, the Hima, which I only learned how to properly say it after hearing you say it, because I'll call it a Hima. Again, if you watch any of my other interviews, my Arabic is horrible. An Arabic word you translate as protected. Translation also given in the Encyclopedia of Islam, which also gives forbidden as another literal translation for Hima. And as you already know, because you mentioned in your book the way haram is used, especially by the average Muslim in everyday use, you might get the idea that forbidden is the literal translation of haram, though you don't see it that way. And unlike the creation of the pre-Islamic Hijazi haram, we do have documentary evidence of how Himas are created. So what exactly is a Hima? How is it created? And what are the characteristics that distinguish it from a haram? Yeah, what are the characteristics that distinguish it from a haram? Because I do notice that in later debates on the subject of haram and hima in Medina, you do mention that some Muslim scholars kind of thought that they were basically the same word, haram
Yeah,
and hima.
yeah. So there's often sometimes from, as you say, the early Muslim scholars, sometimes from modern scholars as well, an argument that haram hima are more or less the same thing. They're yeah, two different words if you like for the same practice. I think it's pretty clear that there's a difference. The reason I translate hima as protected space is I don't. It's difficult when you're applying modern, or especially modern concepts from a different language
Yeah.
to pre-Islamic Arabia. But hima seem basically they seem to be reserved pasture lands.
Okay.
So they it's a place, it seems to be a place where tribal groups kept their animals for pasture and you weren't supposed to interfere with them while they were in those areas. And again, they seem to have been very extensive territory, some of them. Some reports associate them with particularly sort of famous groups in pre-Islamic history. So there's some groups who are, so the Ghassanids, for example, in northwest Arabia, who are said to have become kings in the pre-Islamic period. They're given the title Malik. And sometimes though, like people with that title, Malik, are said to have possessed Himars. So there's also like sort of royal areas for, or areas where particularly powerful leaders could keep their animals. But I think it's that, and we get that sense from pre-Islamic poetry as well that has survived. Raiding another group's himar and stealing their cattle, stealing their animals.
Yeah,
Seems
yeah. You
to
cited one poem in there in your book about how the he. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but it just I thought this poem was kind of funny, if I remember it correctly. How the guy basically saying we don't want our hemas transgressed, but we have no problem transgressing
yeah,
other people. So
yeah. It seems to be a sort of common enough cause of boasting amongst the pre-Islamic Arabian poets that their tribal group is strong enough to raid other people's himars, but their own himars are it kept protected and kept secure. So I do think they're different, and I mean in a way that bit of my argument is a more, I was just dealing with the fact that some people had thought that they were the same thing as harams, and as you say, when you look at the way that some early Muslim scholars write about Medina, they also talk about Himar in that context as well. So I had to get my head around what that meant as well.
I'm trying to think about the reasons behind the Prophet creating a haram in Medina, and just thinking of all the reasons behind it. I, for a second, was thinking, maybe he did set up a hema and not a haram. Maybe it had other purposes besides religious purposes, but more so to, grazing land, maybe protect plants, which is also a part of the haram. I was just trying to wrap my head because it was a new concept, and I was actually might have agreed with some of those later or early Muslim scholars who debated if the Medina had a haram or a hima. And you also draw attention to a more modern conception of sacred space, going just a little bit more south to the Hadramaut or Southern Arabia, which is the Houtas. I believe R.B. Sergiant he put forth the idea or theory that the Hautas is actually the descendant of the Hijazi Haram. But you don't exactly see it that way just because of how one functions compared to the other. Do you still do you still hold to that position, or maybe has it changed a bit, considering or having read more, research more on Hatas and Harams?
Um, I think I loosely stand by. Well, no, I think I do stand by the argument I made in my book. Sargent's argument is very interesting. It's based on his own observations of how Halter's functioned as protected or perhaps sacred spaces in, I guess it was sort of mid 20th century Yemen. Um, and then he, in interesting ways, applies the conclusions from those observations to what he thinks Muhammad and Muhammad's followers were doing in Medina. Um, I, I suppose I just think it's, and I, in a way, like I'm not saying he's definitely wrong. I just, I just think that it's a methodologically problematic premise. I mean, as a historian, I struggle with applying observations made in the 20th century to a development in the 7th century.
Which we will see once we move on to the Constitution of Medina.
Yeah, and I mean, Sargent had I guess he had a loose methodological principle that not a lot changed in the in maybe particularly the sort of the tribal areas of the Arabian Peninsula over that period. But I just don't know how we know that. I mean, 1300 years is quite a long time. I would expect a fair bit of change myself.
Yeah,
So,
definitely.
so I think that's why I had a problem with that in terms of a problem with his argument, and I decided to. I think I decided to sort of to leave that where it was and move on and try and understand what was. That's why I tried to understand what was going on in the pre-Islamic Hijaz itself. And despite the fairly sort of sparse references and difficult references that we get to Harams and Himars, to try and put together what information we did have to see what might have been going on in the Hijaz itself in the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries CE.
Okay. And we're still in the Hijaz, but moving north of Mecca to Yathrib. Yathrib is actually a really ancient city, and once or a settlement. According to the epigraphic evidence, Yathrib appears to be a very ancient settlement, as I have written down here, especially when you consider the inscription of Nabonidus, the last Babylonian king, dating back to the 6th century BC, where Yathrib is first mentioned over 1,000 years before the arrival of the Prophet Muhammad, which I found very surprising. So, pertaining to creating sacred space in late antiquity, in your book, you point out that it is not uncommon for the creation of sacred space to happen on space already deemed sacred or once deemed sacred. So, how does that relate to Nabonidus? One of the theories concerning the reasons why Nabonidus sojourned in the oasis of Northern Arabia for 10 years out of his 17-year rule as king of Babylon. Some theorize it was for religious or spiritual reasons. I guess what I'm trying to see is if Nabonidus had knowledge of the existence of sacred space in the Hijaz, specifically in the oasis of Yathrib, that could have possibly been a precursor for what the Prophet Muhammad would create over 1,000 years later. So do you have any information on that?
I mean, it's a very interesting question. I apart from the fact that he has an inscription that mentions Yathrib, I know next to nothing about Nabonidus and his reign. And again, apart from the fact that he had this famous period of his rule away from Babylon in modern Iraq and in the oases of the northern Hijaz, I think if I understand it correctly, his rule, his residence in the Hijaz is particularly associated with the site of Tamar,
Yeah, Tama.
which is a couple of hundred miles north of Medina,
Yeah.
north of Yathrib.
But I understand that he frequented other oases
Yeah,
outside of Tama, like Lihyan and I can't think of the other one off the top of my head that was also in the region. But anyway, so I just thought that maybe he was making a tour around all the northern Hijazi oases.
I mean, it's always possible, of course, but I think the inscription, if I remember rightly, it mentions an itinerary through some of these oases. but not much more about why
Why?
why they were being visited. There have been some. There was an argument a long time ago, um, or in the mid 20th century, I think there was an argument that so some of the other oases mentioned seem to be sites, or seem to be their names in this inscription seem to be very close to the names of sites that appear in the Prophet's period in the Hijāz as
Mm.
sites that had Jewish populations.
Yeah.
And someone tried to make an argument making a link there, but I think it's all, I mean, as far as I can tell, it's interesting. It's interesting to think about what Nabonidus was up to, but I don't
Yeah,
really
yeah, definitely. I think about
think
it.
it.
You know, he always pops up. For some reason, me reading his history about Islam, pre-Islamic history, he always pops up here and there, and then he always kind of sparks some thoughts about, well, why did he go to the northern? Why would he leave Babylon into northern Arabia? It doesn't seem like there was anything going on. But then some people say for spiritual reasons and whatnot. So in Jewish Muslim tradition, we know in Yathrib there was a sizable Jewish population. I believe the strongest opinion is that the majority of those who had subscribed to Judaism in the oasis were more than likely Arab converts, with an unspecified number possibly having lineage going back to Palestine. I cannot remember where I heard this, but a portion of Jews migrating to Arabia after the Bar Kokhba revolt. But within Jewish tradition, are there any? Yeah, I don't know where I remember hearing this. Sorry, because I kind of jumbled up what I was trying to ask. But I remember hearing from Jewish tradition that after the Bar Kokhba revolt, a certain amount of Jews migrated into Arabia. And see, I'm trying to link that with Muslim tradition that I'm aware of, where the reason why Jews were located in Medina was because they had knowledge or word of a prophet arising or coming out of there. And so still I'm trying to build on the idea of, was there a concept of sacred space in the Yathrib oasis before the time of Muhammad? Just because I'm trying to explore every avenue. I know you already kind of alluded to there wasn't, but still, just to kind of play with the possibilities, um, is there anything that could possibly allude to maybe that was the case? If there is anything in Jewish tradition that kind of gives us information about it.
I find it. I think it's hard to see anything particularly clear. I don't know that. I don't know of Jewish sources that specifically mention Medina either.
Mm,
Uh, there are there are definitely from the pre-Islamic period. There are inscriptions in South Arabia and the northern Hijaz that testify to the presence of like Jewish groups residing in some of the oases in the northern Hijaz, for example. Um, what what we don't, apart from testifying to their presence, they don't tell us an awful lot more about what those communities, how they function, what their beliefs were, for example, what their ideas were. And then from Jewish sources in the Islamic period, there are some vague references to communities in the northern Hijaz. I think, if I remember rightly, at a place called Wadi al-Qura, which again is a couple of hundred miles north of Medina. I'm not sure there's too much about Yathrib in particular. The accounts you mentioned, yeah, there are the idea that the Jewish communities of Yathrib and the northern Hijaz were, if you like, immigrants after the Bar Kokhba revolt. That does come up in Arabic sources, I think, a little bit
mm,
as well. But yes, you're right that there as well. Of course, there's plenty of stories about um, the Jewish communities anticipating the arrival of a new prophet, and then those stories can work in various different ways. That's fairly common as for later Muslims thinking about pre-Islamic Arabia. It's a fairly common trope that those, if you like, monotheists, those Christians or Jewish groups already in Arabia were kind of vaguely aware that the prophet was to
yeah, because I
come.
don't think it was only Jewish communities that were waiting for the arrival of a holy man to come and kind of change everything. I think there might have been other groups as well. So basically, there was nothing to inform us about Yathrib having any kind of sacred space before the arrival of the prophet.
Not, I think, nothing specific apart from on the quite small level. So some sources do talk about I don't know, houses, temples, baits for idols, for example, and they might have been, they might well have been a form of sacred space, but on a small level, not on the sort of expansive level of a haram. I'm trying to remember now whether, I'm sure I will have mentioned this in the book. I think Uhud, the mountain north of Medina, just north of Medina, is associated with an idol in the pre-Islamic period. So I suspect if people, people seem to have, as you pointed out from the Nabonidus inscription, people seem to have lived in the oasis, the Yathrib area for centuries. I'm sure they had ideas about sacred space and that they had practices of sacred space. We just don't hear much about it, and I don't see anything in the sources that do tell us about the Prophet making Medina a haram that seem to that explicitly link it to a pre-existing notion of a sacred space there. Now that doesn't mean there wasn't one, but I don't think we hear anything that suggests positively that there was, if that makes sense.
Okay. And what was Yathrib like on the eve of the Hijra, the arrival of the Prophet? I think that's another thing people do not kind of consider what Yathrib. I mean, even I don't think a lot of people consider what Yathrib or whatever if you want to call it Medina was like when the Prophet arrived within the first 5 years. But can you describe the Yathrib on the eve of the arrival of the Prophet? What was it like as a settlement? Um,
Sure. So the first thing to clear up, I suppose, is just a really minor technical point that Yathrib is usually given as the name for the whole oasis area, but also slightly confusingly, it's given as the name for one specific bit of it
yeah,
in the
in the
northwest
north.
as well. So we obviously we use it to refer to the whole area more commonly, but partly what that hints at is that the oasis is not, it's not a sort of single town or settlement. It's a sort of collection of settlements. The area itself is topographically quite well defined between, it's a sort of relatively flat area between some mountains and some tracts of like some volcanic rocks.
Mhm.
And within that area, which is maybe, I might have got this wrong, I'm trying to remember now from when I wrote the book, a few miles, 2 to 3 miles by 4 to 5 miles, something like that sort of area we're talking about between these mountains and volcanic tracts. But within there, lots of different little settlements evolved. So it's not a town, it's not really a town.
Mm.
It's a collection of villages, if you like. And presumably the population was pretty small. I don't
So
think
how did it get the name, the city? In the Quran, it does refer to the area as Medina. I know you can translate that the city, the town. How did it get this name? Was it always known as Medina in short, or is this like a later name that was given to it and it stuck? Was it maybe because it is mentioned in the Quran, and I'm trying to figure out. Ha- what did it go by two names? One name just kind of overtook the other.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I have to say the how the name Medina becomes attached to the area is a topic I slightly duck in the book, because
Yeah, I know. I know.
I'm not 100% sure. So there are, so yes, you're right. So the Quran has a few references to a, it does to a place called Medina al Medina that seems to refer to the precise place where the Prophet and his community are living. It does also mention Yathrib once, the Quran as a place name, and in a similar way. So these references in the Quran to, well, the one to Yathrib and the ones to Medina that seem to be this area, referring to this area, are all in the same. If I remember rightly, they're all in the same context of they're all discussions about the hypocrites who,
Yeah.
the famous Quranic hypocrites who pretend to support Muhammad but don't, a lot of the time. And so it comes, so in that sense, you might get the idea that the two names were perhaps coexisting at that point. There is a debate, well, there was a debate anyway, quite a long time ago in the sort of early to mid 20th century among scholars about whether Medina actually maybe was a pre-Islamic name for the region, rather than, and that it was known as Medina in the sense of a sort of important place, I suppose. But rather than just picking up that name as, obviously it's traditionally explained as being Medina an-Nabi, the city of the prophets, and there's lots of reports where the prophet dislikes the use of the term Yathrib to refer to Medina, and he points out that now it's called Medina. It was called Yathrib, but now it's called Medina. Where do things stand between this? I think I find it hard to see. I mean, just because we do have some pre-Islamic references to a place called Yathrib, and we have no pre-Islamic references to a place called Medina in the area, that I think it probably, personally, I think it probably is a name that comes in over the early Islamic decades.
Yeah, I heard from somebody that it maybe took centuries for the name to stick, and that for a long time after it went, the settlement went by Yathrib. Uh,
Yeah, it's a good question. So these reports that we get that are transmitted in sources of, say, the 3rd century Hijri, the 9th century CE, and onwards, that talk about the dislike of calling the place Yathrib, you can of course read those as suggesting that plenty of people did still call it
still call it
Yathrib.
that. So that was just basically a dialogue between the people
Yeah,
who called it Yathrib and people who were saying, "Nah, we shouldn't call it that." Which we will see coming up. And maybe I asked that question prematurely because it does figure later on in this discussion. Oh, not later on, but in a little bit down the line of this discussion. And for the first Haram in Medina, finally on to what the Prophet came to create, the crux of your book, after we got around all of the other stuff, which I still feel is important. And I do recommend the audience to go and read your book so they know in detail all of the arguments that you laid out. Because I really hope that I'm doing justice as far as presenting them or giving you the platform to present them. But in order to investigate the initiation of sacred space in Yathrib, first began by the Prophet Muhammad sometime after his arrival to the oasis. I imagine you had to survey a wide variety of source material. So, what kind of sources did you look at, and what were the principal sources you relied on? And is there anyone whose work stood out more than most?
so I suppose the sources for how Medina became a haram can be separated into two categories. There's a fairly large number of hadiths about this. These are preserved in compilations of hadiths, but also in Medina's local histories and some other kinds of works. And these present a variety of reasons behind the establishment of the haram. They discuss some rules that went with it. So, for example, that report I mentioned about how Mecca was Ibrahim's haram, and so Medina became Muhammad's haram, that comes up in some of these hadiths. But so there's those on the one hand. Sometimes they give a date for it.
Mm.
Sometimes they say that Muhammad declared Medina's haram on the return from one of his expeditions somewhere else, either to Khaybar or Tabuk, and on his return to Medina, he had missed the place, so declared it a haram. But alongside those, we also have a rather different kind of source, which is the so-called Constitution of Medina.
Yeah.
Now, the Constitution of Medina it's an unfortunate. It's how it's always known in English language scholarship. I mean, the word constitution is incredibly misleading.
Yeah. I too have a problem with it, and arguing with people who subscribe to its title as the Constitution of Medina is very difficult because they use a lot of present-centered language in order to understand it. But I really do think using such language, it puts an idea inside the minds of people hearing it, and it takes away from maybe what the document was intended to be about.
And plenty of modern scholars have done this. Document is very well studied in modern scholarship, and there's a lot of really good work on it that gets to the matter of what's really going on there. That in the it doesn't survive as a document. It survives in copy. It was copied by Ibn Ishaq, a very famous biographer of the Prophet, and a copy of it also survives in a third ninth century tax work on land
Uh,
tax.
Abu
By,
Ubaid.
yeah, by Abu Ubaid. Um,
There was a third one, but or maybe it's not extent, but we have
yeah,
knowledge of a third
yeah.
recension that
We have
exists.
not. We're told about from a very late source, actually. I think a Mamluk era source even tells us about the existence of a third recension, of a third version of it, but that doesn't survive, so we can't compare it. The two that do survive are, I mean, as you might expect, they're a little bit different in wording, but they're quite similar in overall content. One of the versions seems to be um, more reflective of the original, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
So, for example, in the clause that we'll get onto this obviously, but there's a clause in this document that declares Medina to be a haram. In one version, Medina is called Yathrib. In the other version, it's called
Yeah, I
Medina.
think in Ibn Ishaq's Yathrib's Jawf and
Yeah.
Abu Ubaid Medina's Jawf.
Yeah, so there are some differences there, but generally speaking, it's understood as. I mean, it is a really fascinating document, and it does seem to be very early,
Hmm.
and a trace of a very early document from the Prophet's
And you
career.
also mentioned something about the language in it being another telltale sign of it being an
Uh,
ancient or early
it
document.
it's not the language is not particularly, and the way it uses formulae are not particularly close to later documents that
Hmm.
survive. But I mean, there are key things in it as well that, so for example, Quraysh, the tribal group that the Prophet came from, but with whom he spent most of his career in conflict. This document labels Quraysh as important enemies of of Muhammad's community. But quite quickly, obviously, after Muhammad's career, Quraysh came. I mean, all caliphs come from Quraysh. All
Yeah.
they come to
Only
dominate.
caliphs can come from Quraysh.
Exactly, they come to dominate the Muslim community. So the fact that they're singled out as enemies of the community in this document
Yeah.
does seem quite an early feature. It's a fascinating document. The Constitution, as I said, is misleading, but it is a series of stipulations governing interaction between different groups. One of the main modern historians to discuss it, Michael Lecker, calls part of it a non-belligerency treaty. A lot of it is regulating violence. I mentioned that was important for Harams
Yeah.
earlier. A lot of this document is concerned with regulating violence and uh, making sure that disputes are carried out
And it's
without
interesting.
recourse to violence.
It's interesting because the two or the three main Jewish groups are not mentioned in the Constitution of Medina. So it makes me wonder, was it a non-belligerence agreement amongst the whole residency, or maybe certain groups were having problems and it was only to to solve problems between them?
Yeah, this is one of the very interesting things about it is it names very specifically a lot of the groups that are involved in it, and there's lots of and modern scholars discuss this in great detail. There's lots of interesting, intriguing things. The fact that the word Muslim and Mu'min don't quite seem to mean the same thing in the document is discussed by many modern historians. But also, yes, the fact that it names, I can't remember how many, but a handful of Jewish groups, but none of them are the famous.
Yeah, not the powerful An-Nadir, Kareza, or what's the other one? Nadir, Kareza, and the
Yeah,
Kanuka. Yes.
Um, so they're not mentioned in the document in this text at all, um, and it doesn't seem to have been a document that concerned all the inhabitants of the oasis. It it was probably drawn up quite early in Muhammad's time in Medina, shortly after, maybe not immediately after the Hijrah, but shortly after the Hijrah. That's the way it's placed in the two versions in which it survives.
Hmm.
Place it quite soon after the Hijrah. So it seems to reflect an early stage in Muhammad and his community's attempt to negotiate a position for themselves
Hmm.
in Yathrib, Medina. It's it sets up the key thing it does in some ways is it sets up both Muhammad and God as the arbitrators of disputes.
So in
So
that sense, it is kind of a religious document,
yeah,
not totally secular.
yeah. I mean,
Or
I mean, God is an important person in the, and Muhammad's status as his prophet is mentioned in the, and definitely as a prophet. I'm pretty sure he's mentioned as the messenger of God as well.
Yes.
Well, in the, if I remember rightly, in the document. So that's important. It's clear that Muhammad's authority comes from his status as prophet, as messenger of God, and the document seems to be placing him at the center of, well, specifically at the center of controlling disputes. But of course, I think we can see that as the foundations of a sort of a power base and authority base more broadly. And for me, of course, the reason this became interesting is it has this one clause in it. It's about, I think modern scholars usually divide it into somewhere between 60 and 70 clauses, something like that.
Yeah.
But one of them declares, as you mentioned earlier, the Jawf of Yathrib
Yeah.
to be a Haram. Specifically says for the people of this document. So again, that what does that suggest? It suggests that Muhammad created some form of Haram at Medina. It just, I think it suggests it in slightly different ways to the later hadiths tell us, but it does seem to suggest that Muhammad was doing something important. It seems to be a Haram that was specifically, as it said, for the people of this document, so for the community that Muhammad was building in the region. And the other great thing is what the word Jawf means, like where this Haram was.
Yeah. You translate it as valley.
Yeah, Jawf is a sort of, I mean, it would be nice, as I said, Medina is the oasis is an area between mountains and lava tracts. That's the area in which later hadiths put the Haram. And it would be very straightforward just to read the word Jawf as referring to that area as well, the sort of the flat land between the slightly rockier and more mountainous
I
terrain.
was thinking, was it maybe because you also mentioned that Yathrib is also an area of Yathrib, and I was thinking, well, maybe there's a valley in that Yathrib, and that's what it's talking about. Then why would it be so far in the northern corner?
Yeah, I mean that's a very real possibility. So
Also, I'm not too far off for thinking something like that. That the valley of what's it the Yathrib's Jawf
yeah,
Yathrib Valley could be the valley in the area of Medina called Yathrib.
yeah, it could this sort of valley flat space in a place called Yathrib. Yeah, it could very well have referred to that.
Mm.
And it's why might it have been a more specific place? One suggestion has been not my suggestion that it might have referred to a specific place that was economically important
Right.
and that could have been a source of conflict. And this document about resolving conflict was trying to sort of demarcate this area as belonging to nobody, so
But you
that
don't all the way subscribe to that.
everybody. Sorry, I
You
missed
don't all the way subscribe to that.
that. I don't. I think it's a good idea, or an interesting idea. I do think it's worth bearing in mind. I it leaves open still, and this doesn't mean it's wrong, but it still leaves open the very interesting question that if what Muhammad declares is a haram in a very specific part of the oasis, when we start to see discussions a century later about Medina's haram and they apply it to the whole area between these mountains and volcanic tracts, that something then has to have happened in the intervening period to have expanded that original haram, and that might well have happened.
Mm.
But it still leaves an interesting point. And as you say, why they'd have picked this particular area, I don't necessarily think the argument is wrong that it's one particular area. Maybe the place called Yathrib, maybe somewhere else. I do think that as I said, I do think that there's a disconnect in some ways between what this hadith tells us about the Haram and what the Constitution of Medina tells us about the Haram and what later hadiths tell us about the Haram.
And I'm trying to figure out that disconnect because we'll just move on to this topic right now. With the passing of the Prophet and his generation, it does kind of seem like the Haram that he created, I don't want to say became forgotten because as you mentioned, it seems like whatever its original boundaries were between the passing of the prophet and a century later when these topics or discussion starts to arise again, that maybe the boundaries had expanded,
Mm.
and that, as you also mentioned in your book, from an Iraqi, maybe sociologist or historian, that jurists are not interested in historical developments, only creating ideas and stuff like that. And so, how the Haram expanded its boundaries was forgotten by jurists because it just wasn't important at the time that it was happening.
Yeah, the later debates get in some ways quite sort of quite technical, but also quite interesting. I find it quite striking that if you can, it's very different from discussions of the Meccan Haram in the by early Muslim jurists, that when they discuss Medina's Haram, there is no agreement on where its boundaries are. On where there are plenty of discussions of where its boundaries are.
Jabal AR,
Yeah,
Jabal Thar, between Jabal AR and Jabal Thar.
yeah. So there's lots of stuff going on here. They often put it between the mountains, between the volcanic tracts. Sometimes, though, they name specific places which are far beyond the mountains and the volcanic tracts,
Yeah.
so which I mean miles beyond. Sometimes there's this whole debate about a series of reports that give the name of a specific mountain as one of the boundaries, Thawr, but
Doesn't
lots of
exist.
other scholars then say that's not a place in Medina, though that's a place near Mecca, near Mecca. So they debate that, and the reason it's interesting is because the tempting thing to do as a historian is to say, well, if people aren't 100% sure where its boundaries are, that might just mean it's not important,
Mm.
and that it's in a way that they don't know because it's not really relevant. But at the same time, we do have plenty of evidence to, I think, reassure us that at the same time as these debates were happening, people did treat Medina's Haram quite seriously, and it was quite an important thing for many people. So it's that's an intriguing disconnect to me, and my solution to this, which I still stand by as a plausible solution. I don't know if it's the only possible one out there, is that boundaries were being moved over the first couple of centuries after the Prophet's career, and as you pointed out, I make this point, later jurists weren't interested in the historical development. They just said where they'd heard they were, and didn't refer to the fact that they might have once been there and then moved and then were expanded further or something like that. That's my way of solution. That what the hadiths and jurists are doing is collapsing 2 centuries at least of development into one
One
event.
thing. Which I think the word you used is the perfect for what they were doing, harmonizing. It doesn't seem like they were trying to just deny, disregard, or get rid of anything, but how do we reconcile all of this information? And so they were able to designate Jabal AR, Thar, figure out Thar doesn't exist in Medina, so they substituted it with Uhud. Well, now what do we do with the volcanic tracks? Which I really don't know where the volcanic tracks are or how to distinguish them on a map. Is it the lava
Yeah,
area that's
yeah,
in
it's
the
these. You can see it if you look on a satellite image. You can see to the west and east of the town these areas of volcanic.
yeah, I see a dark area that kind of goes around.
Yeah,
So I'm wondering, so those are the volcanic
yeah. It's just
tracks,
they're not. I don't think they were particularly tall or anything. They were just in the pre-modern period. They were just areas that you
demarcate.
you couldn't do anything with, basically. Like you couldn't build there, you couldn't cultivate there.
Mm.
They were a sort of natural end point to the oasis. They come up. They're very famous in Medina's history. There's a famous battle in the late first century between an Umayyad army and the Medinans, who are revolting against Umayyad rule, and it's called the Battle of the Hara. The Hara is the name for one of the names for these volcanic tracts. It becomes an important. They're a sort of well-known feature of Medina's landscape.
And the geography does form a natural settlement. Just looking at the satellite NASA sky view of it, like you can definitely see how the natural boundaries kind of form. And of course, as you mentioned in your book, they're not totally connected with a little bit of literal artistic license or however you described it. They were able to make it. But yeah, it was just interesting all the harmonizing and debating that went on trying to distinguish its borders.
Yeah. I think that part of what's going on as well, actually, is that for some, I mean, most of these debates are occurring amongst legal scholars, amongst jurists, and I think sometimes they wanted precision where earlier authorities hadn't been as bother
Precise.
precision. So for an earlier authority, where asked where is Medina's Haram, could just say, oh, it's it's between the two mountains or whatever. And then a later jurist would say, well, those two mountains don't meet, so we have to find a way of saying where it is in the other places as well. And I think that might be part of it as well, that later some people wanted more specificity
Until
than
you
I,
finally come full circle.
yeah. So you start to get further sort of harmonizations and rationalizations there.
And that wasn't the there were numerous things that were debated as far as Medina's Haram. And this is actually the last segment of this discussion, just because I don't want to hold you up any much longer. And there will be a part two, so we can continue the second half of your book, which is to me the most interesting part. That is more so like a roller coaster, because then you go through the historians and how they went around with the different topography in order to designate certain spaces. The Prophet did such and such, and then the Umayyads and their governors and officials come along and start building in order to kind of, I'm not going to give the reasons for why you detail in at the end of the book, but just I just found that the second half to be quite a roller coaster ride. But I do want to talk about the Haram and the Hima. Now that was debated as well, the status of Medina, if it contains a Haram or if what they perceive to be a Haram is really a Hima, which I can kind of see how some scholars leaned in the direction of Hima with its special specifications of not of letting animals graze, not harming plants, no fighting. Even though I think Himas do kind of permit fighting, but yeah, I'm not gonna. I'll let you describe that.
Yeah, there's I guess ultimately there's a bigger debate that's I found a bit more interesting, but one of the starting points for it, yes, is this. Some scholars have this very technical debate about whether Medina is a haram or a himar, and some scholars try to argue it had both. So it had a more central haram and then a much wider himar around it. Um, and I think partly, in a way, like these debates are interesting in and of themselves, but I found them most interesting because they clearly fed into this wider debate that emerged about whether Medina had a haram at all or
Mm.
should be considered a haram at all, and which we see in, well, really in legal hadith scholarship a bit and legal literature of the 3rd century Hijri, 9th century CE onwards. There are hints of it earlier, but it really we really see it happening from the 3rd century Hijri onwards. This debate between, I guess, the sort of the famous classical schools of Sunni law didn't necessarily exist at this time, Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, Hanbali, but those scholars who later sort of came to be seen as Hanafis and whose arguments were carried on by Hanafi legal scholars essentially denied that Medina had a haram. And
That was so shocking to I couldn't imagine a Muslim again. Your work is the whole topic in and of itself is new to me. And your work introduced how sacred space is established, and to see such a prominent jurisprudent school in Sunni Islam deny that Medina had a haram altogether was such a shocker.
yeah, I mean, partly again, it refers back to this point that this evidence is really jurists debating things, and I think there's plenty. I mean, I put some evidence in my book of people who are like non-juristic literature, that people who are loosely known as having sympathized with the Hanafis were perfectly happy thinking that Medina was a haram. Like
Mm.
this really does seem to have been a jurist debate that didn't go far beyond the kind of the academic circles in which these jurists were working. But yeah, I found it very interesting. Interesting to think, because in a way it has important implications for how we understand Medina's development as a holy city. If
Definitely.
this idea of a haram is so integral to many people's understandings of Medina as a sacred space.
Did you only look at the Sunni schools?
No,
As far as I mean, I know you did mention the Shi'i schools as well. I guess what I'm asking is, what where were the Mutazilites in this Haram debate? Where were the Ibadis in this Haram debate, or were they, or was it just a kind of a Sunni Shi'i discussion
I
that was being had?
I found plenty of discussions of the issue amongst all the famous the four famous Sunni schools of law, and a little bit beyond in Sunni circles, a little bit beyond them, and in say Imami, Ismaili, Shi'i literature as well. I did look into Ibadi literature, and I just couldn't find anything. That doesn't mean it's not there. Ibadi literature, I, I, I I personally struggle with finding a lot of things in it. But and I know that there's many experts out there who might well know more than me on that literature and its use on this. But I couldn't find anything.
They're more of a legalistic. They're very legalistic in how they have constructed. You don't find much. They depend on a lot of other people's histories. They do have their own histories, but when it comes to the wider Muslim history, they have no problem citing Tabari, and so I think that also might be one of the obstacles in that.
But I found plenty of discussion of this issue among Sunnis and then among some Shiis as well. The Shi'i evidence actually is quite useful for how, in a way, to point out to us that the that it that many people held Medina to be a haram is not the only reason that people thought it was a sacred place, of course. So a lot of the Shi'i legal literature, not quite to the extent of the Hanafis, but challenges the status of Medina's haram.
Mm.
So I found a report in a 4th century Hijri Shi'i text that one of the imams was believed to have declared categorically that even if Medina was a haram, it wasn't the same thing as Mecca's.
Mm.
So there is some challenge there, but at the same time, as perhaps we'll talk in later discussion, it's in Shi'i texts that we see the earliest ideas about specific pilgrimage rites to Medina and to the Prophet's grave and to various other sites associated with the Prophet and his family. So it's interesting that I don't think just because people deny or question the status of Medina as a haram doesn't mean they were questioning all other aspects of its sanctity as well.
Mm.
But nonetheless, I did find those Hanafi debates quite interesting. It was clearly a touchy point at some times between Hanafis and others who disagreed with them. Yeah.
And I think maybe the strongest opponent against the Hanafis and their not seeing Medina as having a haram was Ibn Abi Shayba, uh,
Yeah.
which I really wish his hadith. I don't know, maybe you know, but I really wish his hadith collection was translated in English because I'm told that his hadith collection is very interesting compared to the others.
It is very interesting. I mean, obviously all Hadith compilations can be very interesting in their own ways. This is an interesting collection. I mean, it would be a monumental task to try. I'm pretty sure it has over 10,000 Hadiths in it. It would be a huge task. But I guess the interesting thing for this discussion is that like most Hadith compilations, it's kind of organized by topic, right? But the stuff about Medina's Haram doesn't come in a section on Medina's Haram. It comes in this separate bit of the work that's a refutation of Abu Hanifa. It's the section is called that survives within this wider Hadith compilation is called the book refuting Abu Hanifa, the eponymous founder of the Hanafi school of law, and it just goes through a series of topics where Ibn Abi Shayba basically presents hadiths and then just has a line afterwards where he says Abu Hanifa argued the opposite.
But sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. It's just what you said kind of just sparked a thought in my mind that the Hanafis didn't, the early Hanafis didn't battle, or proto-Hanafis, they didn't combat people who believed Medina had a haram with hadith or tradition, but they used more rational proofs. And it wasn't until Al-Tahawi where he uses rational proofs as well, but then he starts combating the traditionists with traditions of his own as far as why Medina is not a haram.
Yeah, so in the I guess the 4th century, the early 10th century CE, Tahawi has a sort of he's clearly concerned that Hanafi doctrines need to be justified by hadiths, and in terms of Medina, I've never seen anybody find or present a hadith that says Medina is not a haram or something like that, right?
Mm.
So Tahawi it's quite creative. He finds all these hadiths, or a few hadiths in which one of which is, I can't remember if it's the Prophet or one of his family members who owns a little bird that he keeps in a
Oh
cage,
yeah, yeah,
kept in a cage. And Tahawi uses that to say, well, if Medina were a haram, that wouldn't have been possible,
yeah.
because that would be violating the rule about mistreating animals. And he finds lots of hadiths like that and uses them to say, well, in this case, Medina can't have been a haram. I reiterate, I don't know that for Tahawi this meant that he didn't think Medina was a sacred place. He just clearly had trouble
Yeah.
envisioning it as a haram like Mecca's. Yeah.
And I think you mentioned for some of the proto Hanafis that it might have been Abu Yusuf, the Qadi for the famous Abbasid Harun al-Rashid, that he didn't necessarily deny
Mm.
Medina's haram status, but he had questions about it.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's hard to Abu Yusuf. What survives probably by Abu Yusuf is a treatise on taxation.
mm,
And in this treatise, there's just this very brief mention of Medina's. I can't remember exactly what it says, but I think it's to do with the plant life around Medina being protected, and that's the only glimpse you get from from one of his right from reports about what he thought that suggested he actually might not have been particularly interested in this debate, and that maybe it's something that only emerged as a debate. So he lived in the late eighth century CE, and maybe it's a debate that only emerged after that period.
mm.
Um, but it's clearly important to. So Ibn Abi Shayba is sort of the generation after Abu Yusuf, a generation and a half, 2 generations after Abu Yusuf, and he it seemed to matter to him. So,
Definitely.
and then and then the debate, we do see it being carried forwards as well in later centuries.
How did they end up reconciling? When did the Hanafis kind of just and drop the whole questioning if Medina had a haram or not? Did they just kind of just start seeing things as? But you also mentioned that there was a certain process in which the Hanafis were undergoing where they started to lean more towards the tradition, how the Hanbali, Shafi'i, and Maliki schools understood tradition.
Yeah, it's interesting. Was that is that process of these four schools sort of, if I don't, to put it very loosely, sort of agreeing the boundaries within which they were allowed to disagree.
Mm,
We They still debate topics. I mean, in my the literature that I was looking through when I was studying this, I got as far as the late Mamluk period. So the 15th, I think, yeah, into the 15th century CE, and some of the jurists are still having this debate.
really?
Then it doesn't. Again, I don't think there was certainly by this point a practical repercussion of this debate beyond the texts in which they were debating it.
It didn't trickle down into society. If I was to take a time machine, ask somebody on the streets of 10th century Damascus, hey, this debate between Abu Hanifa and was going on about a haram status, you know anything about it, they probably wouldn't be too.
Yeah, I don't. I've seen there is some evidence that beyond this very academic discussion, like people still just generally loosely considered Medina a haram. Like it's hard to know what they necessarily meant by that,
Mm.
but they considered it a haram, including people who seem to have loosely sympathised with the Hanafi school. And I've never seen any indication beyond this juristic literature that people. I don't think so. That people were specifically questioning Medina state. It does come across as a fairly academic debate.
Well, if they had Twitter or Facebook back then, maybe it wouldn't have been because that's maybe one of the good things and bad things about social media. It brings us all closer, and a lot of what would have remained in academia is now amongst the masses for better or for worse. So,
Hopefully, much of the time for better.
Yeah, hopefully much of time for better. Well, in this age of information, also the age of willful ignorance, I really do hope that it leans towards more beneficial uses than negative. But we will conclude on that, and I do hope that we can reconvene for a part two, because as I told you many times before, your book, as far as from introduction or from the beginning to the end, is only about 190 pages. But when you read it, you would think it read like something that was 500 pages just because of, and you were actually really good at keeping a lot of, you were really good at condensing the information into bite-sized pieces. To where if it was myself, I don't think I could have done it so succinctly. I probably would have took up so many. I mean, when I look at my questions and how I write them out, I take up so much space. I couldn't have done it like that. So your work is actually greatly appreciated by myself, and it was actually a friend who recommended your work to me because he had read it. Um, as well as other friends who have mentioned your articles. So, your scholarship is actually pretty well known. And actually, anybody, they can go on my YouTube. I didn't know about this before speaking to you, but I did upload a BBC discussion on Antara ibn Shaddad, and you spoke on that as well. So I do advise people if they want to look at any more of your work or hear anything else from you to go and check out that BBC discussion because Antara ibn Shaddad is an interesting figure in and of itself. So,
Thank you.
all right. Is there anything else you want to say before we reconvene? Maybe sum up everything that, or maybe plug in any of what you might be working on at the moment, or where else we can find you.
No, I the things on my university website gives the information about what I'm working on and things. I just want to say thank you again for inviting me to this discussion. I've really enjoyed it. It's been great.
Oh no, I really enjoyed it too, and I enjoyed reading your book. You don't have an Academia EDU page as of right now.
No,
Because I found out about your latest article by typing your name into Twitter, and quite a few people were sharing. It had came out maybe that day. Quite a few people were sharing your article on Twitter, and after that, it was just like a snowball effect of people mentioning your name to me, and I
right.
just thought like maybe I should reach out to him, and that's why I reached out with two separate because I didn't know which one. I thought both of them were interesting, and then I only came to find out about your book later, and then I was like maybe I should talk about this because, anyway, I think you kind of know how these things develop. It was quite a few things I wanted to speak about until I rested on this topic. So,
Yeah, great. Anyway, thanks again for having me.
yeah, no problem. I'm not going to hold you up any longer, and we will discuss to reconvene for part two. Thanks again.